June 6, 1944. 0134 hours. Saint-Mère-Église, France. Hauptmann Wilhelm Monk stood in the town square, watching a building burn while French civilians formed a bucket brigade under German supervision. The fire had been started by a stray Allied incendiary bomb earlier that evening, and now the whole damn town was lit up like a Christmas tree. Church bells were ringing. People were running everywhere. It was chaos. Then Monk heard the roar. Aircraft engines. Lots of them. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. The night sky was filled with transport planes, and from them hundreds of white parachutes were blossoming like deadly flowers. American paratroopers. Falling directly into the town square. Into the light. Into the open. Into what would become a slaughter. Monk's men immediately opened fire. The American paratroopers were silhouetted against the flames, hanging helpless in their parachutes, descending at walking speed into German machine gun fire. Some died before they hit the ground. Others landed on rooftops and were shot climbing down. A few got tangled in trees and telephone poles, where German soldiers picked them off like target practice. It was a massacre. These idiots dropped their men directly into a defended town. Monk shouted to his lieutenant, unable to suppress a grim laugh. What kind of incompetent fools planned this operation? They've just killed their own paratroopers. What Hauptmann Monk didn't know, what none of the German commanders scrambling to respond that night could have imagined, was that those scattered, confused, supposedly doomed American paratroopers were about to accomplish something unprecedented. Within hours, small groups of lost, disorganized Americans would seize a key town, cut vital roads, secure strategic bridges, and create such absolute chaos in German rear areas that the entire defensive response to the Normandy invasion would collapse into confusion. The chaos wasn't a mistake. The chaos was the weapon. And those American paratroopers weren't lost. They were everywhere. Which turned out to be exactly where they needed to be. This is the story of how American paratroopers turned the most disastrous airborne drop in military history into one of the most successful operations of D-Day. How German confidence in their defensive positions crumbled when American soldiers started appearing literally everywhere at once. How a night jump that should have been a catastrophic failure became the reason the Normandy invasion succeeded. And how German laughter turned to panic as they realized the Americans weren't just attacking their front lines, they were already behind them in their headquarters, cutting their communications and raising absolute hell. The plan for the American airborne assault on D-Day was actually pretty straightforward on paper. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, roughly 13,100 paratroopers plus another 3,937 glider troops, would drop inland from Utah Beach in the early hours of June 6. Their mission was simple: seize key causeways leading off the beach, capture the town of Saint-Mère-Église to control the main road north, secure bridges over the Douve River, and basically raise enough hell behind German lines that the beach landings could succeed. The paratroopers would jump at night, at low altitude, around 600 feet, which gave them maybe 15 to 20 seconds of descent time. They'd be carrying insane amounts of equipment, upwards of 100 pounds per man. Weapons, ammunition, explosives, medical gear, rations. Some guys had so much gear strapped to their legs that they couldn't walk normally, had to waddle to the aircraft like pregnant penguins. The training had been brutal. These men had spent nearly 2 years preparing for this moment. Jump after jump after jump. Weapons training. Combat drills. Night operations. The 82nd was a veteran unit. They jumped into Sicily and Italy already. The 101st was newer but had trained just as hard. These weren't raw recruits. These were hardcore, motivated volunteers who'd signed up specifically to jump out of airplanes into combat. Crazy bastards, every one of them. But here's the thing about complicated military operations. Reality has this nasty habit of punching even the best plans in the face. And on the night of June 5 to 6, 1944, reality showed up with brass knuckles. The aircraft carrying the paratroopers encountered a massive cloud bank over the Cotentin Peninsula. Pilots climbed or dove trying to maintain formation. Then German anti-aircraft fire opened up, tracer rounds streaming through the darkness, shells bursting around the lumbering C-47 transports. Planes took hits. Some exploded. Others went down in flames. Pilots broke formation, took evasive action, and basically did whatever they needed to do to survive the next 30 seconds. In the chaos, pilots hit the green light, the signal for paratroopers to jump, wherever they happened to be at that moment. Which meant American paratroopers were dropped all over hell and creation. Some landed 20 to 30 miles from their designated drop zones. Some landed in flooded marshlands and drowned, dragged under by their heavy equipment. Some landed in German positions and were killed or captured immediately. Some landed in the English Channel and were never seen again. Out of roughly 13,100 paratroopers dropped that night, only about 1 in 6 landed anywhere near their intended drop zones. The rest were scattered across 300-plus square miles of occupied France. Units were completely intermixed. Officers couldn't find their men. Men couldn't find their units. Radio equipment was lost or damaged. Heavy weapons were missing. Supply bundles landed miles away from anyone who could use them. By any reasonable military standard, it was a complete disaster. The kind of clusterfuck that gets generals relieved of command and becomes a case study in how not to conduct airborne operations. Except here's what actually happened. Those scattered, disorganized American paratroopers proceeded to accomplish their missions anyway. And in the process, they created such chaos in German rear areas that the German defensive response basically fell apart. Private First Class John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had one hell of a night. His plane flew directly over St. Mary-Glisse just as the town was lit up by that fire. Steele jumped and immediately realized he was in deep shit. He could see German soldiers below, could see other paratroopers getting shot in midair, could see the whole disaster unfolding around him. Then his parachute caught on the church steeple. The goddamn church steeple, right in the center of town. Steele hung there, suspended above the town square, watching his buddies die below him. A German bullet had already wounded him in the foot. His knife fell away when he tried to cut himself free. He couldn't reach his weapon. He was completely helpless, dangling from a church in the middle of a German-occupied town while a battle raged below. So Steele did the only thing he could do. He played dead. Just hung there limp, pretending to be a corpse. And somehow, amazingly, it worked. The Germans were too busy fighting the other paratroopers to bother with what looked like a dead American hanging from the church. For 2 hours, Steele hung there in the darkness, listening to men die, watching the battle, praying nobody would look up and realize he was alive. Around 4:30 a.m., the 3rd Battalion of the 505th attacked into St. Mary-Glisse from another direction. They fought a sharp, brutal battle against the German garrison, killing 11 Germans and capturing 30 more. When the shooting stopped, St. Mary-Glisse was in American hands, the first town in occupied France to be liberated on D-Day. The Germans cut Steele down and took him prisoner. But in the confusion of the battle, Steele escaped a few hours later and rejoined his unit. The man had hung from a church steeple for 2 hours, been captured by the Germans, escaped and got back in the fight. That's the kind of stubborn determination that defined the American airborne that night. But Steele's story, as incredible as it was, wasn't unique. All across the Cotentin Peninsula, small groups of American paratroopers were having similarly insane experiences. And collectively, those individual acts of courage and improvisation were tearing German defensive plans to shreds. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commanding the 3rd Battalion 505th PIR, landed closer to his objective than most. He gathered about 30 men, out of the 600 plus in his battalion, and decided screw it, we're taking St. Mary-Glisse anyway. With those 30 guys, Krauss attacked into the town at 4:30 a.m. They fought building to building, killed or captured the German garrison, and by dawn had secured the town and raised an American flag over the town square. Mission accomplished with 5% of his force. Brigadier General James Gavin, the assistant division commander of the 82nd, landed in a swamp. In the darkness, alone. The 37-year-old general crawled out of the mud, found his weapon, and started looking for his men. Over the next few hours, Gavin collected paratroopers wherever he found them, didn't matter what unit they were from, and organized them into combat teams. He ended up leading a mixed force of about 200 men in a desperate fight to secure the bridge at La Fere, a critical crossing over the Murderette River. The Germans threw everything they had at that bridge. Infantry attacks. Artillery. At one point, a German tank column tried to force the crossing. Gavin's scratch force, armed with whatever weapons they'd managed to scrounge, held that bridge against odds that should have been impossible. They held because they were trained to think independently, to adapt, and to never quit. That bridge stayed in American hands. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole landed miles from his drop zone, in the 82 ND sector instead of the 101 SDs. He gathered about 70 men from various units and started marching toward his actual objective, causeways 3 and 4 leading off Utah Beach. Cole's mixed force fought their way across flooded fields, through German positions, and secured those causeways by mid-morning. Without those exits cleared, the troops landing on Utah Beach would have been stuck on the shore, sitting ducks for German counterattacks. This pattern repeated all across the peninsula. Small groups of paratroopers, led by whoever was the senior guy present, attacking whatever objectives they could reach. Unit cohesion didn't matter. Following the plan didn't matter. What mattered was fighting. And the American paratroopers were very, very good at fighting. The Germans, meanwhile, were losing their damn minds. Their commanders were receiving reports from everywhere at once. American paratroopers at St. Mary-Église. Americans attacking bridges. Americans cutting telephone lines. Americans ambushing convoys. Americans appearing behind German positions. The reports made no sense. How could American forces be in so many places simultaneously? How many paratroopers had the Americans dropped? Where was the main attack? General Wilhelm Folly, commanding the 91st Air Landing Infantry Division, was driving back to his headquarters when his car ran into a group of American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne. The Americans opened fire. Folly died in the firefight, becoming the first German general killed on D-Day. His division spent crucial hours without leadership, unable to coordinate a response. Colonel Ernst Meyer, commanding Kampfgruppe Meyer, received orders to clear up a paratrooper problem near Corentin. Meyer moved his regiment toward the reported location, only to discover American paratroopers were literally everywhere. His regiment spent the entire day fighting small, confusing engagements against enemy forces that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. By the time Meyer sorted out what was happening, the beach landings were already underway and it was too late to stop them. The 21st Panzer Division, Germany's closest armored reserve, spent the morning of June 6 fighting British paratroopers east of the Orne River. When orders finally came to move north toward the beaches, the division found American paratroopers blocking roads, demolishing bridges, and generally making movement a nightmare. What should have been a 2-hour march took most of the day. By the time 21st Panzer reached the coast, Allied forces had already established a foothold that couldn't be dislodged. German commanders kept waiting for things to make sense. They expected American forces to concentrate at specific objectives, allowing German reserves to counterattack at those points. Instead, Americans were scattered across hundreds of square miles, attacking everywhere and nowhere, turning the German rear area into a combat zone. German units couldn't move without encountering American paratroopers. German headquarters couldn't coordinate because Americans had cut their communication lines. German reserves couldn't respond because they were constantly being ambushed en route. The chaos that should have doomed the American airborne operation ended up paralyzing the German response. And that paralysis gave the beach landings the time they needed to succeed. The equipment the American paratroopers carried was specifically designed for independent operations. Each man had a cricket clicker, a small metal device that made a distinctive double-click sound when pressed. In the darkness, paratroopers would click once, and friendly forces would respond with 2 clicks. It sounds silly, but in the pitch-black Norman night, those simple clickers helped paratroopers find each other and avoid shooting friendlies. They carried Gammon grenades, British-designed explosives that could blow through concrete or disable vehicles. They had folding stock carbines, compact but deadly. They carried shaped charges for destroying bridges or bunkers. Some units had Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosives for blowing paths through obstacles. Every paratrooper was basically a one-man demolition team, and they used that equipment aggressively. All across the peninsula, American paratroopers were cutting communication lines, destroying vehicles, ambushing German patrols, and generally raising holy hell. The Germans couldn't get a clear picture of what was happening because American paratroopers had physically severed their ability to communicate. Private First Class Clifford Mon landed in a garden in St. Mary-Église. He hit the ground hard, got his bearings, and realized he was alone in a town full of Germans. Mon spent the next hour creeping through gardens and alleys, avoiding German patrols, trying to find friendly forces. He eventually linked up with other paratroopers and spent the rest of D-Day fighting house to house in the town. Later, Mon joked that he'd literally had a front row seat to history, since he'd landed in someone's vegetable garden and spent the battle hiding behind their tomato plants. The Filthy 13, a demolition platoon from the 506th PR, became legendary even before D-Day for their mohawk haircuts and war paint, inspired by Private Jake McNeese, who claimed Native American heritage and convinced his buddies to adopt the look. Their mission was to blow bridges over the Douve River, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Their plane got hit before the drop zone, and the men jumped early, scattering across the countryside. But those crazy bastards gathered whatever men they could find, fought their way to their objectives, and blew those bridges. Then they held the bridges against German counterattacks for 3 days until relieved. Mission accomplished despite everything going wrong from the start. The glider infantry, arriving later on D-Day, had their own nightmare experiences. Gliders were basically flying plywood boxes, towed behind aircraft and released to crash land in enemy territory. There were no parachutes, no bailout options. You rode the glider down and hoped it didn't slam into a tree or hedgerow at 90 miles per hour. Many did. The glider casualties were horrific. But the men who survived brought heavy weapons, jeeps, and anti-tank guns that gave the paratroopers the firepower they needed to hold their objectives. By noon on June 6th, the American airborne divisions had secured most of their primary objectives despite being scattered all over creation. The causeways off Utah Beach were clear, allowing the 4th Infantry Division to move inland rapidly. St. Miraglisse was in American hands, blocking the main German north-south route. Bridges over the Douve were either secured or destroyed, depending on tactical requirements. The German rear area was a complete mess, with American paratroopers lurking everywhere, attacking anything that moved. The cost had been brutal. Out of 13,100 paratroopers dropped, approximately 2,500 became casualties on D-Day, killed, wounded, or captured. That's nearly a 20% casualty rate in the first 24 hours. Some units had it worse. The 507th PIR was dropped into flooded marshlands. 25 men drowned immediately, weighed down by their equipment in water over their heads. Other men hung up in trees were shot by Germans before they could cut themselves free. Some planes were hit by flak and crashed, killing everyone aboard. But the mission succeeded. Not despite the chaos, but in a weird way because of it. The scattered drop meant German commanders couldn't figure out where to concentrate their forces. The mixed units meant Americans were literally everywhere, making German movement impossible. The confusion meant German reserves spent crucial hours trying to understand the situation instead of counterattacking the beaches. General Dwight Eisenhower, who'd visited paratroopers before they boarded their planes, had been terrified they'd be slaughtered. Some of his staff had predicted casualty rates as high as 70%. When reports came in that the drops had been badly scattered, Eisenhower prepared for the worst. But then came the follow-up reports. Objectives seized, towns liberated, bridges secured. The paratroopers had done it. Against all odds, they'd done it. Years later, General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne during D-Day, summarized the Normandy campaign with simple pride. 33 days of action without relief, without replacement. Every mission accomplished. No ground gained ever relinquished. That's not military hyperbole. That's just facts. The airborne divisions dropped on D-Day, fought continuously for over a month, and held every objective they'd taken. The Germans never pushed them back. Never regained the ground the paratroopers had seized in those first chaotic hours. The German perspective on the American airborne assault evolved rapidly from confidence to confusion to fear. In the first hours, German commanders thought they'd crushed the American landings. Reports came in of paratroopers shot in their parachutes, captured or killed on landing. It looked like a disaster for the Allies. Then the reports kept coming. And coming. And coming. Americans here. Americans there. Americans everywhere. German commanders couldn't figure out what was happening. How many paratroopers had landed? Where were their main concentrations? What were their objectives? A captured German situation report from the morning of June 6th, recovered after the war, shows the confusion. Enemy airborne forces reported in multiple locations. Strength unknown. Intentions unclear. Main enemy force not yet identified. Recommend all units remain in defensive positions until situation clarifies. That paralysis was exactly what the Allies needed. German units stayed in their positions, waiting for orders, waiting for clarity that never came. Meanwhile, American forces were consolidating on the beaches, moving inland and beginning the liberation of France. A German lieutenant, captured near St. Miraglisse on June 7th, was interrogated by American intelligence. His comments reveal how thoroughly the airborne assault had disrupted German operations. We knew the invasion would come, but we expected it at Pas-de-Calais, not here. When your paratroopers started landing everywhere, we didn't know what to think. Were these just raids? A diversion? The main attack? By the time we understood what was happening, your beach landings had already succeeded. Your paratroopers created such confusion that we couldn't respond effectively. The technical aspects of the airborne operation reveal why the Americans succeeded despite the scattered drops. The C-47 transport aircraft, while not particularly fast or well-armed, were incredibly reliable. Even damaged planes kept flying, got their paratroopers over the drop zones, and many made it back to England despite battle damage. The ruggedness of those planes saved countless lives. The T-5 parachute used by American paratroopers was state-of-the-art equipment. It deployed quickly and reliably, even at the low altitudes used for D-Day drops. The failure rate was minimal. In thousands of jumps that night, parachute malfunctions were rare. When paratroopers died on the way down, it was from enemy fire or landing in water, not from equipment failure. The training emphasis on small unit tactics and independent action proved decisive. American paratroopers were trained to fight as part of organized units, yes, but they were also trained to fight alone or in scratch teams if necessary. When the drops scattered everyone, that training kicked in. Junior NCOs and even privates took command of whatever troops they found and accomplished missions. That level of initiative was unprecedented in military operations. The contrast with German airborne forces is stark. Germany had conducted airborne operations early in the war, including the invasion of Crete in 1941. But German paratrooper casualties on Crete had been so severe that Hitler basically forbade large-scale airborne operations afterward. German paratroopers spent the rest of the war fighting as elite infantry, but they never conducted another major combat jump. The Americans, conversely, had embraced airborne warfare. They'd studied German and Soviet airborne doctrines, learned from British experiences, and developed their own tactics. By D-Day, American airborne forces represented the most advanced and capable parachute troops in the world. And they'd proven it in the most demanding test imaginable. One of the most remarkable aspects of the D-Day airborne operation was how quickly the scattered units reorganized. By June 8, just 2 days after landing, the airborne divisions had re-established unit cohesion. Men had found their units, officers had located their troops, and the formations resembled actual military organizations again instead of armed mobs. That reorganization happened while fighting continuous combat. It's a testament to the training, discipline, and determination of the men involved. The psychological impact on German forces can't be overstated. For years, Germany had been the dominant military power in Europe. German commanders were accustomed to calling the shots, setting the tempo, controlling the battlefield. The American airborne assault shattered that confidence. Suddenly, German forces were reacting instead of acting. They were fighting on their own terrain, but the Americans seemed to be setting the terms of engagement. A German corporal's diary recovered near Corentin includes this entry from June 7. The Americans are everywhere and nowhere. You can't move without encountering their paratroopers. They attack from buildings, from ditches, from anywhere. We are told to hold our positions, but how do you hold a position when the enemy is already behind you? The officers don't seem to know what to do. For the first time, I think we might lose this war. That sense of doom, appearing just 2 days into the invasion, reveals how thoroughly the airborne operation had disrupted German morale. These weren't raw recruits writing those words. This was a veteran soldier who'd fought across Europe. And he was scared. The equipment dropped with the paratroopers played a crucial role that often gets overlooked. Each plane load carried equipment bundles strapped under the aircraft, dropped simultaneously with the paratroopers. These bundles contained heavy weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, radios, everything the paratroopers would need to fight a sustained battle. The problem was that the scattered drops meant equipment bundles landed all over the countryside, often miles from the men who needed them. But here's where American logistics planning paid off. The equipment was packed redundantly. Multiple bundles carried the same types of supplies, so losing some bundles didn't cripple units. And each paratrooper carried personal equipment sufficient for 24 to 48 hours of combat. They didn't need the heavy weapons immediately. They could fight with what they had, then scrounge equipment bundles later. German forces, discovering these equipment bundles, were often shocked at the quantity and quality of American supplies. One German report describes finding an American equipment bundle containing morphine, plasma, bandages, and medical instruments, all packed in waterproof containers with clear labeling. The German medical officer who wrote the report noted that this was better equipment than what German forces had available. That attention to logistics, ensuring that even scattered paratroopers would have the supplies they needed, reflects the industrial and organizational superiority that America brought to the war. The famous photograph of Eisenhower talking to paratroopers of the 101st Airborne before they boarded planes on June 5 captures a moment of profound emotion. Eisenhower knew he was sending these men into hell. He'd approved a plan that intelligence predicted could result in 70% casualties. He'd personally visited the units to wish them luck, because he knew many wouldn't survive. The look on Eisenhower's face in that photo, that's the face of a man who understands the cost of command. The paratroopers in that photo, with their camouflage face paint and full combat loads, look confident. Cocky even. They're grinning, joking around. They have no idea what's waiting for them in a few hours. That contrast, Eisenhower's worry and the paratroopers' confidence capture something essential about D-Day. The brass knew how risky it was. The men who'd actually do the fighting knew the risks too, but they were going anyway. Lieutenant Wallace Strobel, visible in that photo with a placard around his neck marking him as jump master for his stick of paratroopers, survived D-Day. Years later, he was asked about that moment when Eisenhower visited. Strobel said, "The general looked more nervous than we did. We were ready. We trained for 2 years for this. We knew it would be bad, but we also knew we were good. We trusted our training, trusted our buddies, and figured we'd get through it somehow. Most of us did. Some didn't. That's war." The impact of the airborne assault extended beyond D-Day itself. The paratroopers held their objectives for over a month, fighting continuous defensive battles against German counterattacks. The Germans threw everything they had at those positions: infantry, armor, artillery. The paratroopers held. They couldn't retreat even if they'd wanted to, because they'd been dropped with no way to withdraw. So they stayed and fought. At the town of Grains, south of Corentin, about 180 paratroopers from the 507th PIR ended up in defensive positions against a German force that eventually grew to over 3,000 men with armored support. The Americans held for 3 days, inflicting severe casualties on German attacks, before being overwhelmed. Most of the paratroopers were killed or captured. But those 3 days bought crucial time for American forces to consolidate on the beaches. At the bridge at La Fere, American paratroopers fought a week-long battle against German forces trying to force the crossing. The casualties were horrific on both sides. The Americans held. That bridge became one of the most contested points in Normandy, with attacks and counterattacks continuing until June 9th when American reinforcements finally secured the area permanently. These were desperate, brutal fights. Hand-to-hand combat. Close-range firefights. Artillery barrages that lasted hours. Men fighting from positions they'd held so long they'd dug graves for their dead comrades right next to their foxholes, because there was no safe way to evacuate bodies. The paratroopers endured this because they'd been trained to fight in isolation, to hold against impossible odds, and to never quit. The German assessment of American paratroopers evolved dramatically as the battle progressed. Initial reports called them scattered and disorganized, easy targets. Within days, reports described them as aggressive and dangerous. By the end of June, German reports treated American airborne forces with wary respect, noting that these units fought harder and more effectively than regular American infantry divisions. A particularly revealing German intelligence assessment from July 1944, captured after the war, stated, "American parachute and glider forces demonstrate exceptional training and motivation. These units consistently exceed performance of standard American infantry divisions. Unit cohesion remains strong even after heavy casualties. Recommend avoiding engagement with identified airborne units when possible." That last line, "recommend avoiding engagement when possible," from the German military that had conquered most of Europe, that's the ultimate tribute to how effective those American paratroopers had proven to be. The technological legacy of the D-Day airborne operation influenced military doctrine for decades. The lessons learned, about drop procedures, equipment design, unit organization, training emphasis, shaped American airborne forces through the Cold War and beyond. Modern airborne units still study D-Day as the gold standard for large-scale combat jumps, even though the actual execution was chaotic as hell. The human stories from D-Day remain remarkably powerful 80 years later. John Steele's ordeal hanging from the church steeple, that's become iconic, immortalized in the film, The Longest Day, and commemorated today by a dummy parachutist that permanently hangs from that same church steeple in St. Mary-Église. Tourists visit that town every year, stand in that square, and imagine what it must have been like that night. The fire, the gunfire, the American paratroopers falling from the sky into German guns. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions still exist as active units in the U.S. Army. Both divisions consider D-Day their defining moment, the operation that proved airborne forces could accomplish impossible missions. Veterans of those units, and the units themselves, maintain strong connections to Normandy. The towns liberated by American paratroopers hold ceremonies every June 6th, honoring the men who died to free them. In 2024, on the 80th anniversary of D-Day, some of the last surviving paratroopers returned to Normandy. Men in their late 90s and early 100s, frail with age but standing proud in their uniforms, visiting the fields where they'd landed, the towns they'd fought for, the cemeteries where their friends are buried. The French people turned out by the thousands to honor them, because they remember what those young Americans did. One veteran, asked by a reporter why he'd volunteered for the paratroopers knowing how dangerous it would be, gave an answer that summed up the whole generation. Somebody had to do it. Hitler wasn't going to defeat himself. We figured we were young, tough, and trained. We'd go do the job and come home. Simple as that. Lot of guys didn't come home. But we won. That's what matters. The casualty figures from D-Day airborne operations tell a brutal story. 2,499 American paratroopers killed, wounded, or captured on June 6 alone. By the end of June, after continuous combat, casualties had climbed to over 4,000 men. That's roughly 30% of the force. For comparison, military planners consider 10% casualties to be heavy losses that might break unit cohesion. The airborne divisions took 3 times that and kept fighting. The psychological resilience required to endure that level of loss while continuing to fight effectively is hard to comprehend from our modern perspective. These were men who watched friends die, who saw comrades torn apart by artillery, who spent weeks living in holes in the ground under constant fire. And they stayed, held their positions, accomplished their missions. The mental toughness that requires is almost superhuman. The final German assessment of the D-Day airborne operations came from Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B defending Normandy. In a report to Hitler dated June 12, Rommel wrote, "The American airborne assault created confusion in our rear areas that prevented effective response to the beach landings. The scattered nature of the paratrooper drops, initially viewed as advantageous to our forces, instead created a situation where German units encountered enemy forces everywhere, preventing coordinated movement and response. The American paratroopers fought with unexpected skill and determination. Their continued presence behind our lines constrains all movement and operations." That's Rommel, the Desert Fox, one of Germany's most respected military commanders, admitting that American paratroopers had fundamentally disrupted his entire defensive plan. Not through superior tactics or brilliant planning, but through sheer stubbornness and determination to accomplish their missions regardless of circumstances. The contrast between German confidence on June 5 and German assessment by June 12 reveals the complete reversal the airborne operation achieved. On June 5, German commanders felt secure in their defensive positions, confident they could repel any invasion. By June 12, they were acknowledging that their rear areas were compromised, their response had been paralyzed, and American forces had established a lodgment in France that couldn't be eliminated. The American paratroopers who made that possible were just regular guys. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from California. What made them extraordinary wasn't superhuman abilities, it was training, determination, and a refusal to quit even when everything went to hell. They'd been taught to fight independently, to improvise, to accomplish the mission regardless of circumstances. And when the night drops scattered them across Normandy, they did exactly that. Today, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, there's an exhibit dedicated to D-Day airborne operations. It includes a restored C-47 transport plane, original paratrooper equipment, and personal items recovered from the battlefield. But the most powerful item in the exhibit is simple, a cricket clicker. That tiny metal device that made a distinctive 2-click sound, allowing scattered paratroopers to find each other in the darkness. Next to the cricket is a placard with a quote from an unnamed paratrooper, recovered from a letter home dated July 1944. "We dropped into hell that night. Everything went wrong that could go wrong. But we did what we were trained to do. We found each other in the dark using those little cricket things they gave us. We gathered whoever we could find and we fought. We didn't know if we'd live or die. But we knew we had to accomplish the mission. So we did. That's what American paratroopers do. We get the job done." That simple statement captures the essence of the D-Day airborne operation. Not brilliant tactics. Not flawless execution. Just determination to accomplish the mission whatever it took. The chaos wasn't part of the plan, but American paratroopers adapted to it and made it work. The Germans who'd laughed at scattered American paratroopers landing in the wrong places learned a hard lesson that night. Sometimes the most disorganized attack is the most effective because it's impossible to defend against. Sometimes chaos is a weapon. And sometimes the enemy isn't lost, they're just everywhere, which is exactly where they need to be. By dawn on June 6, when American troops began landing on Utah Beach, German forces in the area were already dealing with American paratroopers in their rear, cutting their communications, blocking their roads, and generally raising hell. The beach landings succeeded partly because the defenders were looking in 2 directions at once, toward the beaches and toward the chaos behind them. The industrial capacity that enabled the American airborne assault is worth examining. The United States produced over 10,000 C-47 transport aircraft during the war. That's more transport aircraft than Germany and Japan combined produced of all aircraft types in the final 2 years of the war. The ability to field hundreds of transport planes for one operation, knowing that some would be shot down, reflects a level of industrial power that the Axis couldn't match. The parachutes themselves represent another American advantage. Each T-5 parachute was manufactured to exacting standards, tested rigorously, and packed by trained specialists. The rejection rate for defective chutes was high because American production could afford to discard imperfect equipment. German paratroopers used excellent parachutes too, but German production constraints meant they couldn't be as selective about quality control. American paratroopers jumped with confidence that their chutes would open because they knew American industry backed them up. The story of Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers exemplifies the individual heroism that defined D-Day airborne operations. Summers landed near his objective, gathered about 15 men and single-handedly assaulted a series of stone buildings held by German forces. Using a technique he improvised on the spot, kicking open doors and immediately firing into the interior, Summers cleared 10 to 15 buildings, killing approximately 50 German soldiers. His men provided covering fire while Summers literally went building to building, alone, methodically eliminating German positions. When it was over, Summers collapsed from exhaustion. His commanding officer found him sitting against a wall, shaking, unable to speak. Later, Summers would say he didn't remember most of it, that he just focused on the next building, then the next, until there were no more buildings. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for that action. His men called him the bravest son of a bitch they'd ever seen. The fighting around the causeways leading off Utah Beach became particularly intense. German forces understood that if they could keep those causeways blocked, American troops would be trapped on the beach. The 101st Airborne had been tasked with securing exits 1 to 4 from Utah Beach, allowing the 4th Infantry Division to move inland. Despite being scattered across the countryside, small groups of paratroopers converged on those exits and fought desperate battles to keep them open. At Exit 2, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole led a mixed force of about 70 men against a heavily defended German position. The Germans had excellent fields of fire, and the initial American assault stalled. Men were pinned down in the open, taking casualties, unable to advance or retreat. Cole, realizing the attack had to succeed or the entire unit would be annihilated, did something incredible and insane. He stood up, in full view of German positions, blew his whistle, and charged. Just ran straight at the German positions, firing his pistol, yelling for his men to follow. And they did. All 70 of them stood up and charged directly into German machine gun fire. It was suicidal. It was also effective. The Germans, confronted with Americans charging directly at them, broke and ran. Cole's force seized the position and secured Exit 2. Cole would receive the Medal of Honor for that action. He died a few months later in Holland during Operation Market Garden. That kind of courage, standing up when every instinct screams to stay down, leading from the front, risking death to inspire your men, that was common among D-Day paratroopers. Not because they were fearless, but because they were more scared of failing than of dying. The German counterattacks against airborne positions began in earnest on June 7th. The Germans had spent the first 24 hours confused and disorganized. By June 7th, they'd identified American positions and started hitting them with coordinated attacks. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, veteran German paratroopers, attacked American positions near Corentin. These were elite German troops, experienced and tough, attacking American paratroopers who'd been fighting continuously for 36 hours and were low on ammunition. The Germans expected to overrun disorganized American units. Instead, they ran into defensive positions that had been carefully prepared, manned by paratroopers who'd been trained to defend against superior forces. The German attacks failed with heavy casualties. The American paratroopers held. A captured German Fallschirmjäger, interrogated after being wounded in one of those attacks, expressed grudging respect for American paratroopers. "We are elite troops. The best Germany has. We thought we would easily defeat these American paratroopers who'd been scattered and fighting for days. We were wrong. They fought like devils. Every position had to be taken by storm. They did not surrender. They did not retreat. We took heavy casualties for every meter gained. These Americans are worthy opponents." That assessment from German elite troops, acknowledging American paratroopers as equals or better, represents a complete reversal from the mockery of June 5th. The logistical challenges of sustaining paratroopers in combat for over a month are staggering. Paratroopers jumped with maybe 3 days of rations, basic medical supplies and limited ammunition. Everything else had to be brought in by follow-on forces. But the front lines were fluid, German forces controlled many roads, and supply convoys were constantly ambushed. American quartermasters performed miracles keeping the paratroopers supplied. Glider missions brought in additional troops, ammunition, and medical supplies, flying unarmed transport planes into combat zones to land in fields surrounded by enemy forces. Truck convoys fought their way through to forward positions, often arriving shot up and depleted but delivering enough supplies to keep units fighting. The paratroopers held partly because American logistics refused to let them fail for lack of supplies. The medical evacuations from airborne positions were particularly challenging. Wounded men couldn't always be evacuated immediately. Battalion aid stations treated casualties under fire, with limited supplies, often in buildings or barns that were actively being shelled. Medics and doctors performed surgery by flashlight, used morphine sparingly because they never knew when resupply would arrive, and made life-or-death triage decisions constantly. Captain Stanley Morgan, a battalion surgeon with the 101st, kept a diary during the campaign. His June 10th entry reads, "Operated on 17 men today. No anesthetic except morphine. 2 died on the table. Nothing I could do. No blood plasma left. Out of bandages, using torn sheets from French houses. The building we're using as an aid station has been hit twice by artillery. We just keep working. What else can we do? These men depend on us." The French civilian population played a crucial role in supporting American paratroopers. Despite German occupation and the risk of severe retaliation, French civilians hid wounded paratroopers, provided food and water to American units, and gave intelligence about German positions. Some French resistance fighters actively fought alongside American paratroopers, guiding them through the countryside and helping them avoid German patrols. In Saint-Mère-Église, Madame Simone Renaud, the mayor's wife, personally cut down American parachutes from trees and buildings, gathered equipment bundles, and hid them from German soldiers. She provided food to American paratroopers hiding in the town before it was liberated. After the war, she became an advocate for preserving D-Day history and building memorials to the paratroopers who'd liberated her town. She maintained correspondence with American veterans for decades, attending reunions and hosting visits to Normandy until her death in 1985. The tactical innovations developed during the Normandy campaign influenced American military doctrine for generations. The concept of vertical envelopment, using airborne forces to attack enemy rear areas while conventional forces attacked from the front, became a standard American tactic. The emphasis on small unit independence and initiative became core to American military training. The integration of air and ground operations pioneered during D-Day shaped combined arms doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The weapons carried by American paratroopers were specifically chosen for their combination of firepower and portability. The M1 carbine, lighter than the standard M1 Garand rifle, allowed paratroopers to carry more ammunition. The folding stock variant could be carried more easily during the jump. The M1A1 Thompson submachine gun provided devastating close-range firepower for urban combat. The M1919 Browning machine gun, though heavy, gave paratrooper units sustained fire capability that could suppress German attacks. But the real weapon was the men themselves. Years of training had created units that could function effectively under the worst conditions. Paratroopers were trained to fight at night, in urban terrain, in open fields, and forests. They practiced immediate action drills until responses became automatic. They learned to fight as part of organized units but also to improvise when units got scattered. That training investment paid off when the D-Day drops went to hell and paratroopers had to rely on their skills rather than following a plan. The German forces defending Normandy were a mixed bag. Some were veteran units transferred from the Eastern Front, hardened troops who'd survived years of combat against the Soviets. Others were static defense units made up of older soldiers or conscripts from occupied territories who had limited combat experience and questionable loyalty. The paratroopers fought both types and beat them both, though for different reasons. Against veteran German troops, American paratroopers succeeded through superior firepower and aggressive tactics. American units routinely called in artillery and air support, overwhelming German positions with coordinated firepower that the Germans couldn't match. Against less experienced German units, the psychological impact of fighting American elite forces often caused the Germans to retreat or surrender rather than fight to the death. A German regimental report from June 15, describing fighting against the 82nd Airborne noted, "Enemy paratroop forces demonstrate aggressive tactics and effective use of supporting fires. Our units report heavy casualties when engaging these forces. Morale impact on our troops is significant. Men express reluctance to attack positions known to be held by American airborne units. That reluctance to fight American paratroopers, appearing just 9 days after D-Day, shows how quickly the German perception had shifted. These were the same German forces that, on June 5th, expected to repel any invasion easily. By June 15th, they were openly reluctant to engage American elite units. The airborne cemeteries in Normandy today contain the graves of 2,499 American paratroopers killed on D-Day, plus thousands more who died in the weeks of fighting that followed. Walking through those cemeteries, seeing row after row of white crosses, the scale of sacrifice becomes real in a way that statistics can't convey. Each grave represents a young man who jumped out of an airplane in darkness, knowing he might die, doing it anyway because his country asked him to. The inscriptions on some graves are heartbreaking. Unknown. Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God. These are paratroopers who died so far from where they landed, in such confused circumstances, that their bodies were never identified. They're still there in French soil, unknown but not forgotten. The liberation of France, which began with those paratroopers landing in darkness on June 6th, would take almost a year. Paris was liberated in August 1944. The German border wasn't reached until September. The war in Europe didn't end until May 1945. But the crucial first step, the operation that made everything else possible, was D-Day. And D-Day succeeded partly because American paratroopers absorbed impossible missions, sustained terrible casualties, and accomplished their objectives anyway. The famous quote from the movie Saving Private Ryan, "Earn this," captures something real about how D-Day veterans felt about their service. They'd survived when friends hadn't. They'd been part of something historically important. And they felt an obligation to live lives worthy of that sacrifice, to honor the men who died by making the most of the freedom they'd won. Many D-Day veterans lived quiet lives after the war. They came home, got jobs, raised families, and rarely talked about their experiences. The trauma of what they'd seen and done wasn't something you could easily discuss, especially in an era when mental health wasn't well understood. But they carried it with them always. The memories of friends killed. The close calls that could have gone differently. The weight of having survived when so many didn't. At the Airborne Museum in Saint-Mary-Église, there's a wall where veterans have left messages over the years. Handwritten notes, photographs, letters. One message, left by a veteran in 2004 on the 60th anniversary, reads simply, "I jumped into this town 60 years ago tonight. Afraid. Young. Determined. We did what we came to do. My friends who didn't make it deserve to be remembered. I'm here to remember them." That's what D-Day means to the men who were there. Not glory or heroism, though both were present. But memory. The obligation to remember friends who died. To ensure their sacrifice meant something. To tell the story so future generations understand the cost of freedom. The Germans who laughed at American paratroopers on June 5th learned their lesson in blood. The Americans who jumped into hell on June 6th taught that lesson with courage, determination, and stubborn refusal to quit. The chaos that should have doomed them became their weapon. The confusion that should have paralyzed them enabled their success. The scattered drops that should have been a disaster turned into one of the most successful military operations in history. Hauptmann Wilhelm Mohnke, who'd watched American paratroopers fall into Saint-Mary-Église and assumed they'd be slaughtered, survived the war. In a 1980s interview he was asked about that night. His response, "We thought we'd killed them all. We shot them in their parachutes, killed them on the ground, captured many. We thought the American airborne assault had failed. Then more paratroopers kept appearing. From everywhere. They were in our rear areas, cutting our communications, blocking our roads. By dawn we realized they weren't defeated, we were. Those American paratroopers we'd mocked the night before had taken the town right out from under us. We never got it back." That reversal, from confident mockery to shocked defeat, happened all across Normandy that night. German commanders who'd expected to repel the invasion watched their defensive plans fall apart as American paratroopers made coordinated German response impossible. By the time German forces understood what was happening, American troops were streaming off the beaches, and the invasion was unstoppable. The laughter stopped somewhere around 2 a.m. on June 6th, when German commanders realized American paratroopers weren't just dying, they were fighting back and winning. By dawn, the laughter had turned to desperate calls for reinforcements that couldn't arrive because American paratroopers controlled the roads. By noon, it was acceptance that the invasion couldn't be stopped. The American paratroopers who made that possible were just doing their jobs, following their training, supporting their buddies, accomplishing their missions. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just soldiers doing what soldiers do, fighting because they had to, enduring because quitting wasn't an option, and winning because losing meant their friends had died for nothing. The D-Day airborne operation wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to what was planned. But it worked. And sometimes that's all that matters. The mission succeeded. The beach landings succeeded. France was liberated. Germany was defeated. And it all started with American paratroopers falling from the sky into German-occupied France, scattered across the countryside, confused and disorganized and scared, and fighting anyway. That's the real story of D-Day paratroopers. Not superhuman heroes, just regular guys doing an extraordinary job under impossible circumstances. The Germans laughed at them. Then the Germans stopped laughing. Then the Germans lost the war. Game over.